And we didn't have that many snow days.
We certainly didn't. I don't
No.
remember either. Better safe kids than at home than.
I think it's more liability different.
I'm sure. All right. Well, we're getting back into Romans. We just finished chapter 12 last week, and you may recall we finished up by talking about how Paul, speaking under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, calls us to a radically different kind of life than would normally seem to be the good idea, just trying to make your way in a world where you have, of course, violent people, unjust people, and so on and so forth, where he says, again, finishing up, never avenge yourself. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. Rather, feed your enemy when they're hungry, give them a drink when they're thirsty. Basically, return good for evil, suffer evil rather than risk doing evil by returning the favor of blow for blow and all that. Which you may recall led us at least to start feeling out the question, so what are we supposed to do? Does that mean you just kind of assume that evil people are free to be evil upon Christians? And, well, if somebody comes into your house and decides to steal all your stuff, I guess you Christians say, hey, you forgot my coat too. Or if they, heck, God forbid, come and try to kidnap your kids, I guess I just have to sit there and let them do it. Is that how far this goes? Well, is there any room for any kind of actual vengeance? Like we said, understanding vengeance here, meaning less about getting personal, emotionally satisfying revenge and more as an instrument of justice whereby you balance the scales, so to speak. And I pointed out, chapter 13 is where Paul then lays out the people and the instances where vengeance comes to the fore. And this is going to get us very heavily into the issues of what we often call in this country church and state issues, but Lutherans traditionally talk about it as two different kinds of kingdoms that God rules over. The kingdom of the right and the kingdom of the left. We'll get into that a little bit. But the place of God-given authority, often, as we'll see, for the purpose of curbing evil, punishing evildoers, and in that sense, having the right and the duty, in some cases, to even act with violence. But let's not anticipate everything right off the bat. Chapter 13. Okay. Let's start. We'll just read this whole 1 through 7, and then we'll probably spend a good amount of time talking through issues related to this.
I can read. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For the rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries our God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed.
All right. Now, I expect we'll probably spend pretty much all of the time here tonight digging into this. So let's just start first. A little later, we'll get to what we were talking about vengeance and responsible use of force and who is allowed to use force and under what circumstances. Well, let's start here with the idea of verse 1, where he talks about what a Christian duty is, and he does very much mean this as a continuation of how he's talking about what Christians are supposed to live like. Not only are we supposed to look out for each other as our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, as again in 12, not only are we supposed to deal with evils done to us personally in very unique ways by returning love and blessing for hatred and curses, but now he even goes and says, now this is how you are to respond to those who are a governing authority. First of all, what should we be to those who are in authority?
We're under them.
Yeah.
You should respect them.
Yeah, we're under them. We should respect them. Paul even uses the word be subject to them. That means, like you said, put yourself under them. Acknowledge their authority and submit to their authority. Okay. And the reason that Paul says that, well, why should we submit to these authorities? Going on through verse 1 here.
Well, because God is the one that instituted them.
Right. Paul's very direct claim is there is only one source of any real authority in this world, and that's God, who is the highest authority. Everyone who is put into a position of authority is therefore given that authority by God himself. And therefore, since the authority has been existed by God, what is our response to them as Christians who respect God and his authority? We respect the people that God has raised up in authority over us. And this applies, of course, in other sections of the scriptures we can go to. Children should be subject to the authority of their parents. And by extension, and I do very much mean by extension, citizens should be subject to the authority of their rulers. And we can go into other areas of life. Workers should be subject to the authority of their overseers, and so on and so forth. But this is the basic chain of reasoning. God gives them the authority, and therefore, because we have confidence in God and we trust in God, and of course we're under his authority, we also submit to the authority of those he places over us. And by the way, notice Paul does not get into to quibbling about what kind of structure the governing authority is organized by. That is, he doesn't talk about are we talking about therefore a monarchy, a democracy, a dictatorship, an anarchy. Monarchy is kind of out because that just assumes there is no authority. But point being, he doesn't talk about the type of governments. He just talks about a blanket statement of governing authorities. And by the way, what is the kind of governing authority obviously in place at the time that Paul is writing to the Romans?
Emperor.
The emperor who lives in that very city, Rome. So he is referring, the nearest instance of this is the Roman emperor himself, and therefore all of the governors and so forth that the Roman emperor appoints and who serve under his authority as his authorized representatives. But again, Paul doesn't directly say avoid or be subject only to the emperor who happens to have his authority. This is not some kind of divine right of emperors and kings. He says, whatever authority there is. And so in a certain sense, no matter what the governing structure is, the governing authority, if it is put in authority over you, is always there by God allowing it to be there. And this goes also to the question, it doesn't even matter how they came to authority. That's not really Paul's question here. He's not getting into political philosophy about which kind of government is the most just and the most God-pleasing, or how must one come into authority in order to be considered by the Christian as worthy of being subject to. Now, this is kind of hard, of course, for Americans to swallow, but that does mean democracy is not the divinely mandated form of government. It just isn't. Neither is democratic republics, which is more appropriately ours. And by the way, it does not matter whether you happen to have been conquered by the neighboring king, and now you live the second generation under his rule, or whether you happen to have been the heir of a revolution fought against a king. The governing authority over you, whether democratically elected, whether they seem to inherit by the fact that they just are the kids of the previous ruler, whether you were conquered in conquest, whether your country conquered some other area. The point is, however and whoever happens to have been put into in authority, God's providence, we talked about this in the sermon, the thing by which he orders all things in the universe. God arranges things so that whoever is up in authority, he has allowed to come into an authority, and therefore he has very specific responsibilities and duties he imposes on those in authority, and therefore that they are authorized by him to do. Not because God spoke out of the cloud at this particular president or that particular king and said, okay, I'm installing you in office, and this is what you are to do. But just as the way that the scriptures talk about the duties and responsibilities, and especially as we're going to see here, what Paul talks about Romans, the purposes for which God intends governing authorities to use their authority, God already plans for all the people who come into power. Whether it was fair or unfair, whether it follows the rules of justice or not, God can work even through the unjust rise of authority to still do his will. And we Christians, in recognition of God's providential will on the one hand, and the fact that his allowance of this person to come in authority gives this person duties and responsibilities, under God, we submit to the authority of that person. Does that make sense? Or body, as it may be.
It makes sense, but you think about Hitler.
Well, and this gets into, so what about bad authorities? Now we'll just immediately draw, like, since you brought it up, Hitler. Does what Paul says apply to Hitler? Is it the case that Hitler came to power over Germany? Well, it's an indisputable historic fact that Hitler rose to power.
Right.
Did God, in the sense, well, now before we go into Hitler, let me say, do you know what the emperors of Rome were like?
They were pretty bad.
Some of them were decent. A lot of them were really, really bad. Some of them were frankly psychopaths. The one nearest, I'd have to double check exactly when Paul wrote, but it's very possible. He was even writing during the time that Nero, the poster child for insane, self-serving ruler in all of history, was ruling. And yet he was still able to say that about Nero, who actively, by the way, was almost certainly responsible for Paul's death and began actively persecuting the Christians in Rome at the very least. And yet, this is exactly the kind of empire. Paul's not an idiot. He knows what kind of empire he lives in. He can say this thing about. It's not always just. Sometimes it's downright unjust. And yet, Nero is the emperor. God has raised Nero there. Now, that does not mean everything that Nero does is God-pleasing. In point of fact, when God puts somebody in a position of authority, it is very important to understand this is an authorization that God gives you. You are called, to use the Lutheran language, you have a vocation when you have authority over somebody else to do and to not do very specific things. The fact that God raises someone to a position of authority does obligate us to submit to their authority, but it also obligates them to use the authority in very specific kinds of ways and to not abuse it in other ways. Nero clearly was going against the will of God by his indiscriminate punishment of innocent people, Christians, who he almost certainly knew were innocent of the crimes he was charging them with. So now let's fast forward this a long time, several thousand years, to Hitler. Hitler was not a good guy. I don't think we need to argue about this. Does that mean that God did not allow him to come into this position of responsibility? No. And did that mean that Christians were not called to be subject to his legitimate authority?
They were subject.
They were to be subject to it. But that did not mean that Hitler was free as the governing authority to do whatever crossed his mind. As we're going, well, I'll just anticipate it. What is, as Paul says, the big key thing that God uses these people to do, these authorities, is to maintain public order and justice, to be his avengers of wrong, to punish wrongdoers and promote good. And as soon as a ruler steps out of that line of responsibility, takes it upon himself or herself or themselves or theirselves to do anything that promotes evil behavior, actively pursues injustice, or for that matter, squashes and punishes the good, well, that ruler is acting contrary to the authority that God has invested with them, and they are sinning, and God will judge them for it, and he will almost certainly at some point bring up some other authority to limit them. It's not going too far to say that God's response to Hitler's misuse and abuse of his divinely called station was the Allied destruction of his government.
How about, would it have been wrong for a German Christian to have tried to assassinate Hitler?
I think you're thinking of the upcoming Bonhoeffer movie. Bonhoeffer, in case some of you don't know, Bonhoeffer is a very famous Lutheran pastor from Germany during the Nazi regime, who was part of an underground church movement, who, well, just defied a lot of the orders about how the church was supposed to be run and what they're supposed to be doing, and even actively started plotting. At one point, Bonhoeffer got involved in an assassination attempt on Hitler. He got found out, he got imprisoned in camp, and he was executed shortly before the Nazis won the war for his troubles. And now one question is, was he justifying Romans 13? Now we'll come to that question. I just want to make sure before we get to that question about what does it mean to submit, and how far are there any limits to this command to submit? I just want to first emphasize, again, there is no authority except by God, and those that exist, and it doesn't give qualifications about whether they are doing a good job or a bad job, those that exist have been instituted by God. American democracy, with its three branches, separate but equal powers, and all separate but equal. Wrong civics thing in there. The separate checks and balances of the executive, legislative, and judicial branch, just as much as once upon a time the great monarchy of England, as the Empire of Rome, and yes, even Nazi Hitler. That doesn't mean one was better. We can't say anything about which was a better or a worse one. We are just simply saying that just as the alcoholic, abusive father has been charged by God to be a father, as much as the pious, very devoted and conscientious father has also been called to be a father, and both of them have been given authority over their children for the purposes that God sends them, so it is with governments likewise. But it's important to also clarify that just as fathers are called to a certain kind of role and activity in their children's lives, you can judge, and God does judge, just as we can judge the alcoholic, abusive father as absolutely being derelict in his God-given authority and abusing his power in the worst way, for which he should be curbed, should be limited, should be opposed, and yes, should be even suffering the wrath of God, and probably will be by going to jail at some point, Lord willing. while the conscientious, devoted father is a good example of living out God's calling. Same with governments. Hitler, obviously bad, abusive, terrible government. I'm not going to say America is or ever has been a perfect example of that, but compared to, say, Nazi Hitler Germany, shining example of a better way to live out calling that God has for government. Does that make sense? So, but then that brings us, okay, so, and then Paul makes the immediate conclusions. So if you are resisting the authority, that is to say, if you are refusing to submit to them, that is to order yourself under their legitimate authority, you are not just resisting them, you're resisting what God has appointed. You are resisting God, and God will judge you for it. You will incur God's wrath if you choose to resist the legitimate authority that God has ordained over them. So, for instance, just to give you a very clear, a somewhat clear example, I should say, Peter ends up in jail, right? I mean, the guards, they come, they arrest him. Does Peter, whenever he gets the chance to say, this is clearly an unjust government, let's riot against them, let's overthrow this government because they put me in prison unjustly? No, he lets them take him to jail. He submits to their punishment of him, even though he doesn't stop what he's doing, which they order him to stop doing. Going back to Acts, shortly after Pentecost, when Peter and John are in the temple, they heal that man, and they start preaching about Christ and how he is, in fact, even though they crucified him, the Son of the living God. You remember the guards of the temple arrest him. They drag him before the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin orders them punished, and they do submit to the punishment. They rejoice that God allowed them to be worthy of that. They don't riot in the streets. They don't try to stir up their 3,000 followers to say, throw over this corrupt anti-Christian government. They submit to the punishment, but what do they say when they charge them, do not speak in this name anymore? You must submit to God rather than men. So the point I'm raising here is, first of all, it is wrong to refuse to submit to the legitimate authority and power of the government. And apparently, if we took the apostolic example, that even means suffering the government to do injustice to you personally in those ways, without trying to illegitimately try to thwart their authority per se. However, there are clearly limits to their authority. And therefore, there are limits to how much we are called to submit to them. For when they exceed their authority, we do not have to submit to them because they don't have authority to do what they are not authorized by God to do. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. It's kind of hard to swallow sometimes.
It is. Well, and
because they're so off base.
They can well, this is the famous axiom. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's a well-known fact that this is the problem. What kinds of people are always going to be in the government? Even the best form are going to be sinners. We're all sinners. It does not matter who is in the governing authority. As long as God is choosing to work through human agents, you are going to have sinners in those positions of authorities, just as even the best of fathers is going to still be a sinner. And therefore will always be open to the temptations that come with authority. Because even though authority is a positive good, what God authorizes them to do is to be his avengers. To be, in other words, again, going to this idea that vengeance is the biblical way of talking about one of the biblical ways of talking about justice in terms of balancing scales. The government is called to administer vengeance on the wrongdoers, to answer for the crimes that they do to other people by punishing them for it. And on the other hand, to promote good behavior. This is the primary role of the government. But the temptations of having this authority to use power, well, on the one hand, it's easy for it to become corrupt in the sense that you start, instead of serving the good of the people you are governing, and this is implied in what Paul is saying, the idea that you are punishing evil and promoting good means you are aiming to curb evil done among the population for the good of the population. You want the population to be living as justly and as well as possible. You are a servant of the people because you are a servant of God. And it's, of course, ideal, therefore, that the governing authority recognizes that they answer to a higher power and that their power derives from the higher power. This is always the superiority of having a religious and especially a Christian in the governing authority, because they at least should in principle recognize their authority is not simply their own possession, that they don't have unlimited authority, that they answer to a higher power. It's not requisite to be in the governing authority. Most governors haven't been Christian throughout history across the world, and yet they're able to sometimes do a good job. But the temptation, as you know, is always there. Start using it to serve yourself, to serve the people who are more important to you, the interests that happen to be more important to the people who have your ear more. Just to use an example of our politics, I think we all know that lobbying happens, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing illegal about lobbying. What's lobbying?
Lobbying's when you try to get a government body or a bill passed or something within the government that would benefit whoever you're representing. Let's say you're representing insurance companies. Then this particular insurance company or some other, you would be lobbying for rules that would make it easier on your insurance company or more beneficial to your insurance company. Right. That's what I think.
No, you're absolutely right. That's lobbying. The group I represent has an interest. We want to influence the people in authority to act in ways that benefit our interests.
And they're just like, I mean, I don't know if it's still so, but they used to be like everywhere in the capital.
I don't know, but I wouldn't doubt if they still are everywhere. But I think we also know that sometimes lobbying is not always what you would call ethical, even if it's legal. That is to say, it's tempting to do favors for the legislatures and the Congress people.
Yeah, maybe give them a present of a dock or a boat.
Yeah,
a trip.
Something that's almost outright bribery.
Right.
Sometimes, I'm sure most of the time, they're a lot more subtle about it, but giving obvious favors down the line or things like that, where you're giving them material incentive that will benefit them to benefit you. And thus, well, what are you telling the person? Use your power to benefit me so that I'll benefit you. And it's less about let's pursue the common good now. And it's about, well, this guy will scratch my back if I'll scratch his, so I'll use all my power to scratch his back, and then he'll scratch mine. Now, sometimes it's also a lot less overtly corrupt than that. Sometimes it's just, well, if all you're hearing all day are three voices talking in your ear, you're not likely to hear all the rest of the voices out there. And I assume, well, what are you going to think is actually important when you have three things always being yelled at you? This is the important thing to do. Your breast's going to get influenced. That's the important thing to do. Point being, temptations, both self-serving and sometimes just out of ignorance, can lead people to misuse their power in really bad ways. Just like you can see fathers sometimes, out of self-interest, pride, whatever, become very bad, destructive fathers. And sometimes out of ignorance and thinking they're doing what's best, but they're just listening to all the wrong people, do things that are destructive for their family. Power is tempting, and it's easily abused by sinners, which we all are. So, what happens when they abuse their power? How do we we'll go to a rather, again, it's just easy to go to near term things that are very obvious examples of how to talk about this. Let's go back to the whole COVID thing, for instance. Now, is it, you would say, within the wheelhouse of the governing authority of our state slash federal government to care about promoting the health of the citizens? I mean, one would hope that they'll care about it.
Well, it depends. I mean, I'm thinking, would they get something out of the pharmacy?
Well, okay, you're already bringing up. There's all kinds of
lot of
potentials for
different-
corruption
Yeah, there
involved in all of
is.
this.
There is.
Now I'm just for the sake of simplicity, I'm not going to get into all of that stuff. We'll just agree. It's hard to know when governments are acting solely in the best interest, especially these days, of the people, or whether there's other forces manipulating behind the scenes. Fair enough. But let's say, so one of the things that the government did to maintain order and try to minimize, and let's just assume it was the best case scenario, that all of them were it's almost certainly not true, because it's never true that everybody acts perfectly in the interest of what they think is right all the time. But let's just assume, for the sake of the argument, that everybody was just acting with the best information they had to do what they thought was the best thing for the life and the health of the citizens. Let's just assume that. Then they mandate, let's shut down the churches. No worship, except for very, very, very small gatherings, and all of that stuff. Is the Christian required to do that?
That's a kind of a tough question to answer in a way, because first of all, you need to obey the government.
Mm-hmm.
But we still want to continue to worship God.
And it is a tough question.
And I think I think we had different answers during the COVID.
There were a lot of different answers given during the COVID pandemic, and usually revolving exactly around that tension that you mentioned. We want to worship God, but we know God calls us to obey, and pastors within our church body all across, along with very good and faithful elders and congregants, and all had, I mean, it was a hard time to figure out, well, what are we, putting aside the health issue, what are we obligated to do for conscience sake? And part of the problem is we just hadn't had to think about that question so forcefully before, and so most of us were just caught off guard. We just were. And it's not to say we always all thought my answer is very much from hindsight, because I think about this very much differently on this side of the event than I did on the other side of the event. On the other side, I was very much we're going to do our best to follow the mandates of the government, in deference to Romans 13, and what we did at our church out in Louisville, just so you, as an example, is we did 100% online services, but we offered communion, drive-through communion, every 2 weeks, and we have like 100 cars go through the communion line. But that's how we did it. So we tried, we're going to offer sacrament ministry, but we're not going to have a public gathered worship. The idea was maybe we can juggle that way and follow both masters at the same time, basically. And if there are options where you can actually manage to seem to respect both authorities, all the better. I'm not saying that was a perfect solution. I'm just saying that's what we did. Now on this side of it, I would say, while the congregation was free to respond to that however they thought was best, in the sense of what would be the best way to care about the health and well-being of their own members while providing them word and sacrament ministry, however that looked like. On the one hand, the church has the command to, and pastors especially, to offer word and sacrament ministry. And for the government to mandate that you cannot offer word and sacrament ministry to everyone who desires it, is a direct contradiction of God's own stated word to our calling, and therefore it exceeds the authority of the government. And we were under no obligation as a church to change any of our worship practices for that, because the government cannot dictate to a Christian how they are supposed to worship God. That's not just a matter of separation of church and state in our legal. That's a matter of we must obey God. And if we truly believe that God calls us to gather together regularly to receive the word and the sacrament, then that's what we're called to do. And it's not up to the government to tell us how, in any sense, we're allowed to do that. They might offer codes of building codes and so forth that we can choose to follow, and we can choose to ignore, embracing the consequences of ignoring it. And this is the big thing, going back to Paul and Peter willingly being thrown in prison. We don't even have to build our sanctuaries the way they tell us to build it. If we truly believe this is the best way to worship God, build it how you want. You have to follow your conscience in knowing what God has called you to do and be. But the government may come and say, hey, we're going to fine you for violating these codes. We're going to jail you for preaching in this pandemic, or again, more extreme, going out to China. We're going to jail you for preaching this particular way about things we don't agree with.
Yeah.
It's all the same. It's just on a different point on the spectrum. And we should, the point is, the church must follow its own mandates, regardless of what the government tells it to do or not to do as it touches the mandate of the church. We should not obey, for instance, laws that forbid missionaries going to certain places. We should not submit to laws that tell you who and how you can preach your gospel lesson, and therefore we cannot submit to any mandate. We do not have to submit to any mandate that says how you should worship together, how many you can worship together, and how frequently you can worship together. That is all an overreach of the state's legitimate authority, and, well, we should, as Peter says, say, we must obey God rather than men. And if you want to fine us, so be it. Now, again, you may have noticed I emphasized at the beginning, that does not mean the congregation itself may not choose to adjust how it conducts its worship services and its word and sacrament ministry, so long as it is, in fact, abiding by the calling that God has given to it. But the government does not have the right or the authority to dictate those things. Does that make sense?
It does.
It seems like to me that the way you did it in Illinois probably was close to the way 75% probably did it.
Yeah, I would say the majority erred on the side of rendering unto Caesar, so to speak.
I know for a while at Fort Myers that we had to call in and we got a number of time that we could meet in, of course, outside in this park in front of the church and take our communion.
Sure.
And wear a mask. It was to wear a mask. And we set separate, everybody there was maybe only, let's say 8 people in this pretty large area. And then they had the drive-by too.
Sure.
And also the little closed, when they ended up coming back but wearing masks, then you had the little closed containers that had the wine on the bottom and the on the top.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay. And you have to open it, hopefully not spill it.
It was a lot easier to give communion in February, though, outside than it would be in Illinois.
Yeah, it worked. The logistics worked. We'll put it that way. It wasn't ideal, to say the least.
But I think the habit of watching it online was one that stuck with a lot of people, and it is still stuck.
Yeah, it proved to be a detrimental
Mhm.
decision to the life
Mhm.
of many a Christian.
Right.
How we reacted to it. And I don't think we'll ever entirely recover
I don't think so
from
either.
it in that sense. And I mean, we have to admit where we have to admit that sometimes we just did wrong, pastors and so forth, in advising our people that they were conscience and duty bound to obey the government mandates, because that just isn't, it wasn't true. And we were wrong insofar as we said that kind of stuff.
Well,
I'm
you
not
know,
saying it was wrong. Again, I emphasize it wasn't necessarily wrong for a congregation to freely decide, okay, who knows what's going on. Just as a congregation can freely choose to decide to close the doors on a snowstorm, congregation can freely choose to decide we're going to change the way we offer this
Mhm.
temporarily for all of this.
Mhm.
But that's very different than being counseled by your pastor, as I'll admit I did earlier on, and I regret that. Saying, well, we have to obey the authorities say.
Mhm.
So
It seemed like it was a time when there was a big fear.
Well, our nation never got thrown into anything like that during our lifetime.
oh gosh, no. There's reasons we all were confused and flat-footed and all of that, and I'm not saying that it's not understandable why we all did that. It's say it's good to, after those things happen, to look back and say, well, what was right and what was wrong about it.
Mhm.
But
But
that's
it does follow this.
right, exactly, and that's why we're talking about it. Isn't to rehash all of the COVID stuff. It's primarily to say something about specifically about the limits of submission to a governing authority that a Christian is obligated to have, insofar as they exceed. And by the way, it's not just the Christian church that the governments can exceed its authority over, though clearly that's an obvious one that's concern to us. The First Amendment is a good amendment in the sense that, in theory, it relatively mirrors, and I say relatively because it's not a perfect mirror, of the idea that the government doesn't have the authority to dictate to Christians how they are to believe and to worship. Only the Word of God has the authority to do that. But it also goes into other arenas of life too. For instance, they do not have the authority normally to intrude on the authority, say, that God gives to other people in a nation. For instance, the government doesn't have the authority to supersede a mother or a father's God-given authority over their children. They just don't. Now, granted, the governing authority is there to ensure that the parents don't drastically abuse their or neglect their God-given duties, and they are within their bounds to punish the father and the mother who, say, actively seeks to damage their child, or is woefully neglectful of their duties. But it is not the government's authority to intrude into the family and to take upon itself the prerogatives that God has delegated to the mother and the father over the child. Similar with the husband and wife, similar with all kinds of different things. Where God gives a point at issue here is where God gives somebody authority, that entity has authority over what God gives them authority. As a pastor, I have authority of a certain kind, a very specific kind, in these congregations. And that authority is to proclaim the word of God purely and rightly, to administer the sacraments, and to forgive and retain sins. That is my authority. I don't have the authority to dictate to you how much you should pay the secretary, or what color you should paint the building. That's not my authority. And you might listen to the advice I give, but you can only listen to it as advice I might give. Similarly, of all the other realms that God places us in authority, parents have their respective authority in their very specific place, but it's a huge amount of authority in that specific role in the family. And it overrides a lot of other people who might have an interest in what goes on in your family. In fact, just as a point of interest, the Large Catechism in our Book of Concord it actually spells out how pretty much every other authority on earth derives from parental authority, and is a reflection of it. We call the governing authorities, Luther says, fathers of nations, because their authority derives from them. He even explicitly says our schoolmasters, our teachers have authority not because the government gives them to it, but because the parents give them delegate authority to them, and it's only delegated. The parents can take it back because it's theirs. And our law kind of reflects this by fancy terms like in loco parentis, that is, people acting in the place of parents. But the parental authority is key. Anyway, all of which is kind of say again, to reiterate the point, to repeat it one more time, each of us, all authority comes from God. And those who have been given authority by God have authority over that which God has given them authority, and only in the place that God has given them authority. Make sense? All right, so let's then talk very briefly about, by the way, that also goes into the question about, what do we do when we're, as Christians, in an unjust world, full of sometimes people who aren't just sinful in the run-of-the-mill sense, but sinful in the way that, yes, of course, their relationship to God is as broken as any other sinners, but who are actively violent, actively psychopathic, actively seeking the destruction. What about the person who, actively is trying to destroy my life? Am I just supposed to sit there and take it? Well, on the one hand, this is one of the reasons God puts governing authorities in there. This is why our governing authorities institute things like delegate authority of this kind to police, people who are authorized to come in and use force to punish, to restrain on the one hand, and sometimes, yes, punish the wrongdoer, in the protection of the life of the other. And by the way, the basic Lutheran principle, the way we always take this is we don't say this overrides what Jesus says in Matthew 5 about do not resist the one who does evil. If someone slaps you on the cheek, turn him in the other. The basic Lutheran point is we hold the both scriptural points in tension here. We don't deny one or use one to override the other. Mennonites will tend to use Matthew 5 to override everything else that the Bible says about use of force, so that you cannot use force, you cannot use violence, which is why all governments are evil, all police are doing something wrong, because violence itself is per se always, always, always wrong, and a Christian cannot participate in those things. This is the Mennonite / response. You cannot do those kinds of. Your only response to evil appropriately is speak out against it and suffer it.
By their conscientious objection.
Yeah, conscientious objection. You never fight in wars and anything like that. And so, well, what do you do with something like Romans 13, I guess, in that, where it actively says the government bears the sword as an agent of God's wrath? That God institutes it for this very purpose. Well, now you can also override it the way that a lot of modern, especially American Christians do, which says basically anything that is opposing evil, allows me to use force. Self-defense, I'm justified as a Christian, not just under the law, but as a Christian. I am authorized to exercise self-defense. This is not where Lutherans actually fall. Lutherans do not actually say that shooting the person who is trying to shoot you is the ideal appropriate response. The idea is anything that is personally done against you, well, Matthew 5 kind of speaks pretty directly. They slap you, turn the other cheek. If they're after to kill you, I mean, yes, you can defend yourself in the sense of try to prevent him from doing this, but not in the sense that you would ever do anything that would potentially be evil. You don't end the person's life to stop them. Rather, be willing to lose your life rather than risk ending theirs. I mean, you're going to heaven. You don't know if that other person is, which is morally superior, which is more beneficial to you.
Okay to shoot him in the arm?
Well, we'll get into it. But point
Or the
being,
leg.
the idea is suffer evil rather than do it personally. However, God does sometimes put you in positions of authority. If you are a father, you are not simply always dealing with just somebody attacking you. If somebody is attacking your children, it is incumbent upon you as a father to follow the call of God and defend your children by restraining the person who is coming after them. And yes, sometimes that does even mean um, well, up to including taking the life of the person if necessary to prevent. Of course, that is absolute last resort, and recognizing that you still may have been sinning and seeking forgiveness after the fact. But the idea is, as far as it only concerns me, suffer the evil rather than risk perpetrating an evil to prevent it. If it concerns others for whom I have an obligation, which, by the way, I am also obligated to all my neighbors, if it concerns the life and the welfare of another, well, then I am authorized by the fifth commandment, you shall not kill, to seek the physical well-being of my neighbor, to try to prevent that person from being hurt.
But that allows me to do it to protect Judy.
Well, nobody else is in the house. You're by yourself.
I don't want to get into that. I didn't want to ask.
Just make sure Judy's always with you.
Yeah.
See, if there's nobody of authority around
Arthur, you're in trouble.
to protect you, you're still saying that goes back to the other verse.
Right, yeah. I mean, does it...
Sheriff's in Benton County.
Mm-hmm. I mean, call the police.
The police is
try to find help. But the point is, if my own life is a danger, I'm not going to actively try to kill this other person to save my life. He might be doing evil against me, but you know what? I've been redeemed. I am going to heaven.
In the nose or something.
What's that? Well, and I mean, just take this logic a little further, though, too. Suppose that, because the evildoer is obviously coming into your house to do some wrong, and let's say he's only coming and potentially going to hurt you, and there's no family that you're worried about anything. How is this different than, say, the fact that he happens to be wearing a badge? Now am I authorized to... Why didn't Peter just kill the guard when he had the chance and run from prison? The guard wasn't doing anything, was acting... I mean, there were governing officials who were acting against what was legitimate for them, and so perpetrating evil that might have, and in fact ultimately did, lead to Peter's death. Why didn't he just pick up a sword and kill him? He tried that, you might remember, in defense of Jesus. You remember what Jesus said? Put away your sword.
Mm-hmm.
Them who live by the sword will die by the sword. And the idea about again, the Lutheran idea is not about what seems to make the most sense in ordinary human responsibility as we think of it in terms of this world, but how do we live according to the actual callings and commands of God faithfully? And as far as we can tell, God says, when it is your own person who is threatened, turn the other cheek.
That's a tough one.
It's a tough one, partly because, well, we're conditioned over and over again. Don't do that. That's weak. That's reckless. That's irresponsible. You need to defend yourself. And partly because it's just the gut human reaction. I don't want to die. I don't want to risk death. I don't want to risk any injury to my property. So of course, and legally, you're allowed to. Nobody in America is going to condemn you for what is lawful self-defense. Christ might. Because, well, on the one hand, does God love the person who is attacking you any less than he loves you? God made that person. God died to redeem that person. You don't know where that person's heart is at, just putting it on a practical salvation kind of trajectory. If he kills you, what's the worst that's going to happen to you?
I think he'll go to hell.
Well, what's if he kills you? What's the worst that will happen to you?
You go to heaven.
You go to heaven.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, sheesh. Take too much from me, buddy. You kill him, what's the worst that could happen to him? You just said it. He could go to hell. I don't know if I want to be the person who is responsible for sending this person to hell just to prevent myself from going to heaven at that particular moment. To put it in very stark terms.
Well, chances are when this person breaks in and you got somebody else in your household, you're probably not going to have time to think through all what you're saying.
No, but a part of it is what are we conditioned to do too, leading up.
Chances are you're going to protect yourself.
It's a good chance. But I will say it's amazing how a person who is convinced of certain things will act differently than you might expect them to act if they've previously convinced themselves of this stuff. But it's just one of the facts that we just need to be honest about what God calls us to do for our own persons and balance it with the vocations that God gives us towards others and under the governing authorities and within the realms of authority he gives us. It is absolutely my God-given duty to defend the lives of my children. Whatever the eternal destination of either my children or the other person, that's just my duty. It's just like the police officers do. This is why Lutherans say absolutely a Christian can, in fact, serve as a soldier or a policeman. Luther even wrote, if your town needs a hangman, go and volunteer to be the hangman, because you're not breaking the sixth commandment or the fifth commandment by doing that. You are serving within the vocation that God has called the governing authority to serve. You will be the hand of God administering vengeance and justice, and that is a right and appropriate use of force and the sword. That's not to say that every time the government chooses to execute someone, it's the right decision. It's just to keep the principle going. When God authorizes you to do this, that is what you are authorized to do. And if he has not authorized you to do this, well, you're not authorized to do it. Don't do it.
Well, hopefully the people that are in court and the jury that convicted that person, that's what you're talking about.
Well, I mean, yeah, that it's the point that Luther's talking about hangman obviously gives the point that Lutherans in principle, or I should say traditional confessional Lutheranism in principle, is not opposed to the death penalty as a matter of principle. Now, as a matter of practical application, in good conscience, you can go either way on this, because you can say, while it is in principle true that God does authorize the government to, well, administer the sword. And sometimes that means, yes, killing those who are a clear and imminent threat to others who have done horrible crimes, and they'll be the instruments of God's wrath there. They are not sinning when it is possible for the government to kill and not sin in that office. However, in practice, you might say, well, I'm worried about all the things about how jury selection happens, what evidence tampering of any particular case, that it's not clear to me that our justice system in its present form could ever be relied upon to be so absolutely correct that we might not kill an innocent man. And therefore, while in principle I agree that yes, it's possible for a governing authority to implement the death penalty, I'm opposed to it in practice because of the way that it's done. A Lutheran can hold that position too. But the Lutheran can hold the other position. It's allowed. They did it legitimately. We can only pray that it was done well. But they were doing the best that they could with what they had. And God allows them and authorizes them to do this. Does that make sense? And I'm not saying you have to agree with all of what I just said. It's just to say this is traditionally why the Lutherans view these things the way that they do, and why we are historically not a very revolutionary crowd politically. We just tend to be a respect the vocations that everybody has and stick to your own. We're over time, so we can come back to this if there's there's plenty more we could talk about, but let's close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
All right.